Thank you. And it's my pleasure to also, I think, be the first person of the day to officially welcome you on behalf of Stanford University. I am at UCLA now, but I was the director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West here at Stanford when we organized that famous trip down the Colorado River with sophomores. And when Iris Gestrom first called me to ask whether we would be interested in hosting here with the Bill Lane Center for the American West in Stanford, this conference on the Olmsted legacy, and I said, yes, immediately, of course. I mean, what more appropriate place could there be to do that? But of course, now I also know that there are many appropriate places where we could have done this, and many in the East Bay regional parks, in Los Angeles, in Yosemite, any number of great places where this could have been done. But I'm pleased to be back here with all of you, and really pleased that you're here. And it's been a really great day so far. I'm going to tell you about 3 projects that have taken me ever deeper into thinking about people and parks and nature, from here in Silicon Valley to California and the American West, around the United States and the world. And I'll put this slide up again at the end, so don't worry if you don't get all of these addresses at the beginning. They'll make more sense at the end, I hope. And you'll know which you're interested in visiting in more depth. But they are the venues in which this work was undertaken and where you can find out more about everything that I'll be discussing. I have, as a longtime journalist and now historian, I have a real envy of makers, of people like you who are out in the world park making, as people said today, which I take to mean both the building and design and construction, but also the ongoing making of parks and people's experiences. I'm kind of like a satellite, or maybe it'd be more of the moment to say like a drone, kind of spying down over space and time. And I think a lot about the past and look at evidence from the past. But I really do care about now and about the future, and I believe that's why we do history, to think about the possibilities that are alive around us today. And here's what I'm going to argue today. And at first I thought I was going to be very, very controversial, but the more I've listened to people this morning, the more I think that there's, that there might be some very interesting conversation. I'm not the only one arguing some of these things. The stories we tell ourselves may not explain much. That's why we revisit the evidence. The Olmsted legacy, and I was told last night that I might get tomatoes thrown at me for saying this, but I think there's been some interesting questions asked this morning and will continue to be asked. The Olmsted legacy may point us in the wrong direction. And contingency matters at every scale. We need to help people make contingency matter at the neighborhood scale in positive ways. And to continue to cultivate a constituency for parks and natural areas, we need to listen to people in place. And who is that we that I'm speaking of? Who are we? I'm thinking of scholars, researchers, policymakers, architects and landscape architects, developers, park managers. The first project I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about these very briefly, and we'll go through a lot of data pretty quickly, grew out of the Spatial History Project here at Stanford with a very talented urban planning studies master's student, Carrie Denning, who's now in the business school here, and a colleague of mine, Rob McDonald, at the Nature Conservancy And we were interested in the history of conservation and the legacy it left on the landscape. And we got Carrie started, she would joke with her boyfriend that she'd pass a park as they were driving and say, "I'm dating that park." She had the task of trying to enter into the California Protected Areas database the date of establishment of parks so that we could begin to learn about the history of the establishment of parks. We had this great database, but we didn't have the date of establishment. Pretty important when you're doing history. And so this just shows how different agencies have, from federal, state, local, have been important in the establishment of parks. This is in the Silicon Valley now. And we realized that we could use this database to ask a question about the conventional wisdom by mining the landscape to examine a counterfactual. And the counterfactual was, it's current among urbanists, some varieties of urbanists, particularly Ed Glazer in his book, The Triumph of the City, to argue that preservation impedes the rational development of the city. That both historic preservation and parks and open spaces, and he argues particularly in the Silicon Valley, apparently he spent a couple of unpleasant years here, I think, that this great landscape that we see around us has been an impediment to the development of housing, and therefore a cause of the shortage and high cost of housing. And so we wanted to examine this, and we did it by examining the counterfactual. We created a model for whether or not housing was likely to be built in a particular area. Obviously, in wetter areas, much less likely. Out on the bay, less likely. Steep slopes, less likely. What were the factors that led to the likelihood of housing being built? And then what was the average density in those areas? So we modeled the historical landscape to create a model of where housing was likely to be built and at what density. And then we modeled how much housing would have gone into parks and open space if none of them had been conserved in the Silicon Valley. And it turns out it's fairly negligible. If every single park and open space had been built on, we'd have about 5% more housing units, not going to have a huge impact on the shortage or the price. I mean, that the low densities would be up in the hills, and that the very high density would be if all those urban parks, small parks, recreation areas were built on. Those, of course, were the things that were created as amenities in the middle of development, as amenities for people. So the second project I want to talk about is called City Nature. And this comes out of also examining thinking about some work that's been done at the Santa Fe Institute on the scaling of cities, that cities around the world scale at constant rates by population, and that their infrastructure increases, their consumption increases, and even their creativity increases. Creativity measured by, for example, the number of patents that come out of a city, creativity measured by the amount of crime committed in a city. But I asked Jeff West, the physicist who's been involved in developing this work with Luis Betancourt at the Santa Fe Institute, what about nature? What about parks? And he said that they had looked at that and they found no correlation. So lots of things scale at constant rates in city, but not nature or parks. And so with my colleagues who are here today from the digital humanities at Stanford, Carl Grossner and Elijah Meeks, thank you so much for working with me on this, with the Urban Studies program here in the Bill Lane Center for the American West, and with the Trust for Public Land, Will Rogers and his crew. We created this project examining if cities scale, why don't parks and nature scale with cities? What explains this variation that we see? And here, these are both the Trust for Public Lands park score on both axes. So, but just so that you can see, there's tremendous variation in the amount of parks and the accessibility of parks in cities across the United States. So we looked at 40, approximately 40 different cities around the United States at their parks. And then we also used national land cover data, and this is really the genius work of Carl Grossner, to look at park-like areas. So what are parts of the city that have the same kind of features as parks, that have more or less the same amount of green or unpaved surfaces as parks do? So we could call those, park-like areas of the city. And we looked at these cities across across a number of factors, demographic and economic factors. And what this graph shows you, and it's a really cool interactive graph that you can go in and you can explore 2,661 neighborhoods in around 40 cities across the United States, and their attributes, both in terms of natural areas, unpaved, parks, and these demographic features. What you want to take, it's really fun to explore this, but what you want to take away from this is, and this is what I call distant reading, I mean, looking at these 2,661 neighborhoods all at once, is that we found that there's no explanatory correlations for the amount of parks and open space, not only in cities, but within cities across neighborhoods. We also then looked at city plans and did text mining on the city plans to see what were the topics that they talked about in relation to parks and open space and habitat, and where did they talk about them in their plans. And we found that this also varied just terrifically in ways that were difficult to understand, except in very idiosyncratic ways across those 40 cities. This, for example, shows the proportion that talk about parks and open spaces habitat versus as other kinds of facilities. So here, the only explanatory variable that really had some correlation was area of the city. The more area a city has, the more likely it is to have. So the land area of a city is correlated with the land area of parks and open space. So when we were looking at that text mining, we were trying to examine whether what people often say in the parks world, that leadership and vision are correlated with the success of parks, and at least as it was factored in these if you could read it in these plans, that was not at all clear to us. I also did a look at the Olmsted's involvement in different cities, and again found no correlation. So historically, where the Olmsteds were involved, we know that they've been involved in some great cities and some great plans, and there's still legacies of that, Baltimore and other places. But overall, there's no correlation. There's no kind of statistical correlation. What we know, so here's Los Angeles, is that parks are more evenly distributed actually than green or unpaved space. Really, so park-like space is more unevenly distributed in cities. Really, green neighborhoods tend to be richer in many, but not all cities. Here, Palos Verdes and the Pacific Palisades. But rich people can live anywhere in the city, and they do, and that kind of destroys the statistical correlation there. Rich people also, they trade off big yards and open space for parks. Park-poor areas of the city can't do that. So here, looking at how I think it's household income or wealth with park need or need for nature. So really, what this shows us is that parks, parklets, if you can't just create backyards with big trees like in Palos Verdes. So parks, parklets, trees are the only way to go in many of these neighborhoods where there's a lack of nature, a lack of the possibility of connecting with nature. And that has to be a public good publicly provided. That's crucial. It's an equity issue, a health issue, as we've heard. More work needs to be done to incorporate, this kind of work perhaps into visions and plans, where we could, think about layering this kind of park need and different abilities of different neighborhoods to provide or not provide for it themselves with habitat. Where can we get the most bang for our buck for people and nature, and especially for people in need of nature in cities? So we could also do more work to integrate this history and culture at a much more granular level. My takeaway from this, and it's, as a historian, this is, I like this conclusion, is that there are no big explanatory process level explanations for this phenomena. It's about contingency. It's about agency of people, organizations, people like yourselves, and that it operates at this neighborhood scale, at a very local scale. So it really does matter what you all do. It matters what we all do. It matters what people do for a variety of reasons over time, right? Conservation has meant, as we've heard today, many different things over time, from preserving watersheds, clean water, the city beautiful, the recreation of good citizens, to here in the Silicon Valley, open space for aesthetic views, to now habitat for species, and coming back around to now we talk about ecosystem services. So again, the clean water, clean air, the health reasons, all of those are a toolkit that has been used and can be used for doing conservation and for park making today in different circumstances. So what do people care about, think about, talk about, act on? This is how can we find that out? How can we listen closely to all kinds of people in all kinds of spaces and learn by listening? And so this is the close listening to go along with the distant reading. This project is parks.stamen.com. It's undertaken with Stamen Design, a design data visualization and mapping company in San Francisco that I'm working with. And for this project, we used the shape of every one of the thousands of parks, open spaces, and preserves in the California Protected Area database to catch, listen to, and see the human stories and images that pour out of parks and natural areas every day in California. We're doing this for two reasons. Well, three reasons, actually. First, to listen. These images and the tweets that you'll see, these don't look or sound like us in this room. So we want to create ways to listen, to learn what people are doing, thinking, saying, feeling, expressing in the normal course of their experiences in parks and out in nature. And we believe that we can learn a great deal about the diversity of experiences this way to understand the constituencies for parks and natural areas unfiltered. These are people who are, tweeting, Instagramming, checking in on Foursquare, posting images on Flickr in the normal course of their enjoyment of parks and open space and natural areas. Second, as a potential organizing tool for park advocates. We've developed some of these. This hashtag YOSE is actually the official hashtag of Yosemite. The National Park Service uses a 4-letter code. It's kind of like an airport code, and we'd like to spread this to all parks and open spaces and natural areas as a way for people to share, like, I don't know how many I should be like General Jackson here and ask, how many of you are on Twitter? All right, so you can start using these hashtags, to share your thoughts and your concerns, to, Organize to, tweet about your favorite park, share your concerns with park managers and policymakers, create a conversation that reaches beyond the traditional advocacy organizations and their members. Listen to what people actually care about as they express themselves. Third, as a tool for managers to listen, to understand their customers. What are they expressing about parks and natural areas? How they see them, how they're using them, what they care about, what their concerns are, as well as, a lot of just fun and sometimes frivolous and sometimes kind of surprising and sometimes shocking things that you can learn by seeing what people are up to on social media. And if they're up for it, and I know, many of you who are managing parks have your hands full, and as I said, I have the greatest respect for all that you do for our parks and open spaces. And not everybody has the time to do this or the staff to do it, but if you're up for it, to participate in those conversations, to go where your customers are already having conversations and participate them. And in this, you can sort on all these different dimensions to see what are the most tweeted about parks. Maybe you have one of the top parks, which are the most photogenic parks. And I'll sort it on numerous dimensions, including the agency that manages the parks. So you can see all the parks that are managed by the city of Los Angeles or by state parks and other organizations. And finally, we built this to help build a diverse community for parks and natural areas in California, to expand the conversation by exposing that diversity, by listening, by having a conversation. I put this up because of two of my close friends who are involved with this work and important projects like this Rue map from Outdoor Afro here in the Bay Area, and Jose Gonzalez from Latinos Outdoors. And we've already talked about this a lot today. We need to do this for two reasons. First, the changing constituency for parks and conservation. Parks and natural areas don't have a future without a diverse constituency in California. For many in the community here in this room and other conferences I've been to, this is a dire prognostication. But when you look at the myriad ways that people are actually already interacting with parks and natural areas and expressing their love for parks and nature, it's exciting and hopeful, not just scary. And I think it's, part of what I have said to other groups like this is, we often hear, what can we do to teach them how to enjoy parks and nature or, get out? And I think it's important to to appreciate nature. And I think that if you talk to anybody and ask the question, you'll hear why they love nature, what is it that they love about nature, what is it that they think, and so that we ought to be asking the questions and listening. The second reason, which we've, I think, heard a little bit about today in the context of California, but I'd like to ask, lift up your head from California, your Olmstedian heads, your head from the American West and the United States, and look around the world. Listen and participate also in this larger conversation. The urban world is doubling in the next 30 to 40 years as human population grows from 7 to 9 billion. All of those people are going to effectively end up in cities, doubling the built environment on the planet. And how that happens, how that doubling takes place, is going to fundamentally shape how people live with each other and with nature. And I think that does get back to some of the Olmstedian ideas that have been talked about all day today. This is going to be an increasingly interconnected, networked world, people getting information on their cell phones and new media. We think that these kinds of tools for connecting with people through social media and new media will be cool and useful in California. We also think they could be useful around the West and indeed around the world as literacy and connection media and becomes increasing, the world becomes an increasingly urban and networked place. So explore and keep in touch. Thanks.